Okay, I'd like to say good morning to everyone. This is Joseph Krolikowski, and we're going to be doing the Statutory and Regulatory Requirements webinar presentation. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. Our participants today, we have you on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is, will this presentation be available after we're finished? We do make our presentations available in two ways. Firstly, we will make the slides available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar in the future with the live voiceover, it will be posted to our YouTube page. And that can be accessed on our website at www.pjr.com. Our presentation for today is going to cover a couple of things. We're going to dig into what are statutory and regulatory requirements and get our arms around what the difference is between the two. We're going to dig into why PJR is auditing statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. We'll explore where ISO 9001 itself discusses statutory and regulatory requirements. We'll look at a few examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that may have relevance in an ISO 9001 audit. I'll have a few concluding remarks and then your questions. Now, in terms of what statutory and regulatory requirements are, there's a few things we can look at to understand. And I always like to start with the official definitions that are given in the ISO 9000 document. ISO 9000 is the fundamentals and vocabulary. These are all the official binding definitions for terms that are used in ISO 9001 and other related standards. So for statutory requirement, this is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. Now, regulatory requirement is very similar. Regulatory requirement is defined, again, obligatory requirement, but this time specified by an authority mandated by a legislative body. So in this instance, the difference is that it is specified then by an authority. So we can understand, at least preliminarily, that statutory requirements are going to be a little more general, and regulatory requirements are going to have a little more teeth to them in terms of how they are defined. Now, the main difference between the two, as I've alluded to, is where these requirements are going to come from. Statutory requirements, as the name would imply, these are going to come from statutes. These are going to be legal requirements that come from laws, that come from state or federal governments, or for our friends that are joining us from other countries outside of the United States, from the local municipality, the local governing body. So here in the United States, obviously, we have Congress. We have both state Congress and we have Congress at the federal level. So regulatory requirements, again, as the name would imply, these are going to come from regulations. These are going to be things like EPA requirements, OSHA regulations, FDA, FAA, all of the letter bodies, so to speak. Now, regulations are going to be rules. These are going to be issued by an agency, and this is an agency that has been empowered by the government, by the local government. They've been empowered to regulate an industry, or in the case of the United States, to do something related to the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR. One good example of this is the Food and Drug Administration. They are statutorily authorized to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, to get down to the heart of it, to the meat of it, this is going to be specific labeling and packaging requirements. Those are going to be found in Title 21 of the CFR, the regulations that are then issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So to simplify this, understand that statutes are laws. And as I mentioned earlier, these are very often going to be general. Regulations, these are going to be the rules developed to interpret the law and ensure that we stay within the law. These are often going to be more specific. So as an example, a statute might say that excessive levels of certain pollutants shall not be permitted in or near major bodies of water. The EPA, in turn, is going to then issue regulations. That's going to help us understand what's meant by an excessive level, what's meant by a major, body of water, and then what is the plan for enforcement of what Congress intended in passing that statute in the first place. So to bring this all back to ISO 9001 and to address why PJR is bothering with this in the first place, well, we're doing it because we have to. PJR is held accountable to a number of requirements as a certification body. Probably none more important than ISO 17021, the 17021 series of standards. The primary of those standards, the -1, has a clause that reads as follows. Auditing shall include the client's management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, ISO 9001 itself also addresses these requirements, and there's actually 6 clauses within the auditable portion of ISO 9001 where they are mentioned. Beginning with clause 512. 512, and pretty much anything under 5.1, relates to management, relates to top management and what top management is required to do within a quality management system. 512A states that top management has to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. From there, we go into section 8.2. There's actually 2 clauses in play from 8.2. The first of these is 822A1, where it states that the organization has to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined and included by the organization during the contractual phase with customers. In other words, that these are part of what you are digging up in your information gathering phase when you're trying to get a contract going or get a bill of sale with a customer, knowing everything that you need to know about that particular product. And then 8231 is very similar. It basically says once you've gathered these requirements, you need to review them. You need to make sure that you are reviewing those requirements prior to any commitment to supply a product to that particular customer. From there, we go into section 8.3. 8.3, of course, is the design section of the standard, and 833C states that the organization needs to make sure that statutory and regulatory requirements are included among the things that make up the design inputs. So in other words, when you're designing a product, that you are aware of any laws or regulations that might be in effect. 842, anything under 8.4, this deals with our interfaces with external providers, suppliers, right? So in 842C1, it states that you need to make sure that any external providers that you're interfacing with are not going to adversely affect your compliance to statutory and regulatory requirements. This is a good one that we're going to be citing a little bit later in the presentation as an example. And then finally, 855A, where it states that when you are establishing your post-delivery activities, so anything that you do that relates to warranty or post-delivery support and so forth, you need to be sure that you're cognizant of again, the relevant statutes and regulations, because this may force your hand, so to speak. You may say, well, I don't want to offer a warranty on this particular product. There may be a law that says you have to. That's one good example. Now, in terms of how we have approached this requirement within the context of an audit, we have placed 2 targeted questions in our audit report that relate to statutory and regulatory requirements. I'm going to show you what those questions look like in a few slides here. What we are intending to do is to prompt our auditors to investigate and to discuss. We go in with no assumptions. Essentially, we just want to make sure that everything has been considered and take the appropriate audit samples if there are any to take. So in terms of examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that are going to be common, probably none are going to be more prevalent than the occupational health and safety requirements. Now, here in the United States, obviously, we have a formal set of requirements, OSHA. I know that in different countries, there are going to be different requirements, but this is very common. Even if it goes by a different name, this is something that we see in all of the territories that we audit. And what does this touch on? Well, this touches on things like personal protective equipment, ergonomics, safety training, and so forth. Obviously, if you are working in a very sensitive industry, if you are working in a very dangerous industry, if it's mining or something like that, this becomes all the more prevalent in a situation like that. International traffic in arms, ITAR regulations. Again, more specific to the United States, this gets into things like controlled access to the facility, records access, and so forth. Safety data sheets. This used to be called MSDS. This gets into making sure that you have all of the necessary paperwork available to your employees on handling, use, disposal, etc., of chemical-based products. Touches on a lot of areas, can get into product cleaners, product packaging, raw materials, and so forth. So how are the auditors going to determine what applies? How is this going to, again, trying to boil this down to how this is going to reflect on the audit itself? Well, one of the things that you have to understand is that our auditors are already looking in these areas already. They're already spending time with these items. They're looking at things like customer contracts, customer purchase orders. You know, if you look at a typical purchase order from an organization, there's always the front page where it breaks down, here's what I'm buying, and here's what we agree to pay for it. And then often there's a second page. And that second page has got all kinds of details on it about what their expectations are. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, there are statutes and regulations that are mentioned on that second page. You'll see this on product blueprints, product specifications also. Sometimes you'll even find it on the organization's website. So these are things that our audit teams are already looking at. So when we trained our auditors on this topic, we said, look, you don't have to do all kinds of excessive additional digging on this one, but you need to be cognizant. You need to be aware of this item. and make sure that you are responding to it appropriately if it happens to come up during your audit sampling. The other thing we've assessed to our auditors is that what we are tasked with looking at here is making sure that the organization has an effective process for identifying what applies and then complying with it. Again, I'll remind you of the verbiage from the 17021 standard. We're auditing the management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of statutory and regulatory requirements. We're not auditing the requirements themselves. We're not OSHA auditors, we're not EPA auditors, and so forth. Our job is to make sure that you have an effective process in place to know what you need to know and then deploy it. And not for us to go into the specific line items therein and start writing infractions. So here's an example of what it looks like in the audit report itself. These are the two questions that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. Firstly, we just ask straight out, is there an effective process for identifying applicable statutory and regulatory requirements? And then as a secondary prompt, we ask, are there any current projects or products that you observed during the audit where it was necessary for you to sample the overall implementation or understanding of the applicable statutory and regulatory requirement? Give us a summary. So for our example here, I've given two of them. In this case, we're going to pretend that this is a supplier for the aerospace industry. So they fall under ITAR. And the auditor said, okay, I saw a sign-in protocol at the front desk. There's locks on the cabinet. There's no ITAR regulated product in-house at today's audit, however. So it's a limited footprint in terms of ITAR. And then just for good measure, we added DFARS. This has to do with domestic sourcing of raw materials. The auditor said, yep, confirm that all suppliers used for raw materials and finishing are domestic sources. Now, if they weren't, potentially, we'd be looking at an infraction against Section 8.4. If you remember, when we were looking at clauses, we saw that Section 8.4 is one of the clauses where statutory and regulatory requirements are mentioned. So will we issue a nonconformance? Well, it's conceivable that if we find a disconnect between an implemented process and an applicable statutory or regulatory requirement, that we might be looking at a nonconformance, possibly. But this requires a bit of considered discretion. First of all, does this issue impact customer satisfaction or the attainment of a quality objective? Now, in the prior example that we gave, I mentioned that you're using a non-domestic supplier. Your customers have made it very clear that they want you to follow DFARS requirements. So in that instance, in that example, possibly yes, we'd be looking at a nonconformance. If it's warranted, our auditors are going to ensure that the requirements cited are going to include an appropriate clause from ISO 9001:2015 or something similar. It's not going to be written exclusively against the statutory or regulatory requirement. That needs to be emphasized. So in conclusion, we want to make sure that we are providing you with a value-added audit. That's very important to myself and to our team. We hope that you will use the points of our presentation today to make sure you've got a better understanding of what our expectations are for statutory and regulatory requirements, and that you'll be ready to answer those points on audit day. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars, two that I'd like to highlight for you today. I have a presentation entitled The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. It's a very popular presentation. We go over processes and how to correctly understand them. We also have a presentation on exemptions and getting an idea of what can and cannot be excused in an audit assessment. And we've got webinars on a wide variety of other topics, things like stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001 itself, and all of the other standards that we offer certification to. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best option for that is to opt in, and you can do that by visiting our website at www.pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address and click subscribe, you will be opted in for updates automatically on new webinars, on news updates in the world of certification and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time today. I hope you have found the presentation to be helpful. I'm going to go ahead and open the panel here for any questions that have been asked. Okay, I'm going to do my very best on the name. Stephanie Gomez de Souza asks, are services such as contact center operations required to comply with section 8.3? I'm assuming that you mean from the perspective of product design. If they are not participating in product design, the clauses under 8.3 probably won't apply. But 8.3 also technically could apply to design of processes. So I don't want to say yes or no definitively. That would be something that would be looked at in the context of an audit. Brian Lashway asks, as a compliance officer, what is an effective method to discover what requirements apply to our company? Well, Brian, there's a lot of avenues that you can follow to determining what applies and what does not, some of which we looked at a little bit earlier in the presentation here. Certainly customer contractual documentation, anything that is referenced on a T&C document, anything referenced on a T&C list from the website, and so forth. Certainly those are going to be the things that are going to be looked at most prominently in an audit context. Beyond things that are raised by the customer, most organizations have access to chambers of commerce, legal counsel, public legal counsel, and so forth, business license filing. These types of things can also raise statutory and regulatory. So I hope I've answered your question. Okay. Keith Wilson asks, would the auditor look for evidence from a supplier if used from another country to show they are applicable to any S&R requirements? Possibly, Keith, not necessarily. Again, this falls into would this, I know there's verbiage, for example, in some of the sector standards. I think in IATF 16949, possibly AS 9100, although I'm not personally super well versed in AS 9100, where it talks about regulatory requirements both in the country of origin and in the country of final destination. In other words, that wherever your product is going, you need to be cognizant of the statutory and regulatory requirements therein. So I'll say tentatively that if that is verbalized in the applicable standard or in the contract, then yes, that's possibly a rabbit hole that the auditor would go down. David Gillen asks, do standards such as ASME, ASTM, etc., consider as regulatory? I believe, David, that those are based on statutes that are issued by the government. If that is the case, then yes, that would fall under statutory and regulatory requirements. We have a question about, is the session being recorded? It is absolutely being recorded. The recorded presentation and the slides will both be available shortly after we're finished here. Give us just a couple of days to get this up for you. Bill Peterson asks, how does the auditor determine a company's employees' qualification to assess what legal and other requirements are needed? Bill, that's a great question in terms of employee qualification and competence. The short version is that an organization is at its own discretion in terms of qualification and competency. They have to be able to show that they have a process, and if there are statutory or regulatory awareness points that are in play, it would fall to the organization to show how they have accounted for that. So I know that's not a slam dunk answer in terms of what an auditor would dig for, but that is the reality of it. We would look at what has been put in place, and if there is a competency point that is then raised, what has the organization done to address that? Okay. Okay, are there any other questions today? Some real good stuff today. Okay, well, I do thank you all for your time. I hope you have a great day. Take care.